I was trapped in a life of silence, controlled by fear until one day, I broke free. But escaping wasn't the hardest part. It was facing the truth, rebuilding from scratch, and finding my voice again. Want to know how I did it? Watch to find out. My first memory of being quiet was when I was 6. I fell while playing outside and scraped my knee. It wasn't the fall that hurt me the most, but the way my mother reacted. She didn't rush to comfort me or ask if I was okay. Instead, she stuffed a dirty dish towel into my mouth to stop me from crying. I remember the suffocating pressure of that towel, the muffled sounds of my own sobs. She told me that crying was too loud, that I was making too much noise, and I needed to be quiet. Even as a young child, I began to understand that noise wasn't just something that annoyed her, it was something that could bring punishment. This wasn't a one-off incident. My mom's reaction to noise, any noise, wasn't just about my crying. It was every sound I made. If I snored too loudly at night, she'd blast a horn in my room until I woke up, disoriented and scared. She said it was to teach me not to snore. The louder I was, the harsher the punishment. This cycle of silence and punishment became the rhythm of my childhood. It wasn't something I ever questioned. I just adapted to it. I became a master of silence. A child who learned early on how to make herself invisible, to never disturb the peace. But it wasn't just my actions. It was my very existence. My mother had misophonia, a condition where certain sounds, chewing, breathing, snoring, drive the person crazy. And while I understood the condition, what I didn't understand was how it became an excuse for her to control every aspect of my life. It wasn't just her condition, it was the way she used it to mold me into someone who was silent, someone who would never cause a disturbance. When I was 9, everything changed. My mom gave me a report card for my birthday. It wasn't a regular report card, though. It was empty, except for a few rows filled with numbers. She called it the quiet points system. I had no idea what it meant at first, but over the next few weeks, it became clear. My mom had started labeling the food in our kitchen. Every item had a number on it. Bread was 2 points, meat was 10. Points were earned by being quiet. The more silent I was, the more points I earned, and the more food I could have. The more I restricted myself, the more rewards I got. It was a system. A simple, cruel system. If I made too much noise, the points would disappear. The system was simple. The quieter I was, the more I could eat. If I made noise, I paid the price. It was my responsibility to keep the noise down. And as I became more accustomed to the system, I began to realize the full extent of what my life had become. Quiet was not just a preference, it was survival. If I was too loud, I wouldn't get to eat. If I made too much noise, I would be punished. I was just a child, a 9-year-old with big brown eyes and a heart full of love for my mother. So, I did what I was told. I remained silent, even when I didn't understand why. I ate what I could, when I could, following the rules without question. I learned to stay quiet when I showered, to avoid snoring, and to keep my movements as silent as possible. But there was always that underlying fear that any noise, any sound, could lead to punishment. One day, after school, I came home and found that I had earned 30 points for the day. My mother handed me the report card, her face full of pride. She led me to the fridge, showing me what I could choose for dinner. I could have almost anything, except for my favorite ice cream. That was the one thing I couldn't have. But I didn't argue. I picked the steak instead, and we sat down to eat. But the steak was overcooked, dry and tough, and as I chewed, I could hear the sounds of my teeth grinding against the meat. Every bite felt like it was an assault on my mother's ears. I tried to chew as quietly as possible, but it wasn't enough. After 5 minutes of painfully slow chewing, I couldn't take it anymore. I discreetly spit the meat out into a tissue, deciding that I just wouldn't eat that night. But my mother wasn't having it. She yelled at me, "What are you doing? A cow died for you today. The least you can do is eat it all." I didn't want to eat it. I was scared to make any more noise, to upset her any further. But she wasn't giving me a choice. She grabbed the tissue, pulled the meat out of it, and shoved it back into my mouth. The pressure of her hands on my face, forcing me to chew, was unbearable. I felt trapped, suffocated by her control. But I still didn't cry. I didn't make a sound. I couldn't. I knew the consequences. It wasn't just about the punishment anymore. It was about survival. If I stayed silent, I might just make it through another day without being punished. The pain in my chest, the knot in my stomach, grew with each passing day. I felt like I was slowly disappearing, like I was becoming less of a person with every breath I took. The quiet became my cage. And it wasn't just physical silence, it was the silence of my existence. I learned to make myself as invisible as possible, to stop making noise, to stop drawing attention to myself. But then, things started to change. My mother started to notice my growing silence. She began to push me harder, to enforce the rules even more strictly. It wasn't enough to be quiet. I had to be silent in everything I did. My whole existence became a careful balancing act of silence, of trying to please her, to earn enough points to survive the next meal. I didn't realize how much I had been affected until one day, when I came home to find that my points had gone negative. I had failed a task, made a noise I couldn't control, and the points I had earned over the past few days were gone. I had nothing left. No food. No points. Just the silence that hung between us. The next morning, I woke up with a gnawing feeling in my stomach. The hunger wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too. I knew I had to keep up the quiet, that if I didn't follow the rules, there would be no food for me, and worse, there would be punishment. That day, I walked to school with my head down, my footsteps light. I had learned how to keep my presence small, how to avoid making a sound as I moved through the world. At school, it was no better. The silence followed me everywhere. I had grown so accustomed to keeping everything inside, to making myself invisible, that I hardly knew how to act around other people. I wasn't like the other kids. They laughed, they joked, they made noise. But every sound I made felt like an intrusion. Even speaking in class felt wrong, like my voice was too loud, too big. I kept my words small, my movements careful. If I could just get through the day without drawing attention to myself, without making a noise, I could survive another day. At lunchtime, I sat alone. The cafeteria buzzed with voices, the sound of laughter, trays clattering, but I didn't join in. I couldn't. The noise felt too much for me. It felt like it was too loud, too chaotic, and I was already living in a world where silence was the only thing that mattered. One day, I was sitting in the corner of the cafeteria, eating my meal in silence, when I noticed something strange. There was a new teacher walking through the cafeteria. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with short, dark hair and an observant gaze that seemed to take everything in. Her eyes locked on me for a moment, and for some reason, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something different about her. She wasn't like the other teachers. She seemed to notice things. She seemed to see things that others didn't. I tried to ignore her, but I couldn't help but feel her gaze on me. She moved through the cafeteria, glancing over the students, but her eyes kept coming back to me. It was unsettling, but I couldn't escape the feeling that she was watching me closely, trying to understand me. I knew better than to speak up, to draw attention to myself, but it felt like she was trying to figure me out. It was like she could see through the walls I had built around myself. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the feeling of being watched, of being noticed, didn't go away. The new teacher, Miss CB, was always there. She'd substitute for different classes, and every time I saw her, it was the same. Her eyes would lock on mine for just a moment longer than necessary, and I would look away, feeling like I had done something wrong. I could feel her observing me, studying me in a way that no one else did. It was both unnerving and strangely comforting. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was paying attention to me. But that attention came with a price. The fear that had been building inside me slowly began to grow, building up like a storm that I couldn't outrun. I knew that my mother would never allow me to be seen, to be heard. She controlled everything: my food, my movements, my silence. I was her prisoner, and I had learned how to stay quiet, how to survive by blending into the background, by not making a sound. One day, when I was sitting in class, trying to focus on my work, I found myself tapping my pencil against the desk. At first, it was an accident. A small, unconscious movement, but then it became something more. The tapping continued, short taps followed by longer ones, and I couldn't stop myself. It was like a nervous tick, a way to release the tension that had been building inside me. But as soon as I realized what I was doing, I froze. I looked around, panic rising in my chest, and that's when I saw Miss CB's eyes on me. She was watching, her hand paused mid-motion on the board as she turned to look at me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I don't know how long it lasted, but in that moment, I felt like time had stopped. My heart raced, and the fear that had been building inside me reached its peak. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't like the teachers who ignored me or the classmates who barely noticed I existed. She was different. She had seen me. She had noticed me. After class, Miss CB called me up to her desk. My heart thudded in my chest as I approached her, unsure of what she wanted. I had no idea what to say to her, how to explain myself. But then she did something I didn't expect. She handed me a piece of paper, a note written in neat, careful handwriting. I looked at it, confused, but before I could say anything, she pointed to the paper, then looked at me. The note read, "Are you okay?" I stared at the words, unable to form a response. My tongue felt heavy, my mouth dry. I wanted to tell her everything, to finally speak up, to say what had been building inside me for so long. But I couldn't. The silence had become too ingrained in me. The fear of making a sound, of being heard, was too overwhelming. I tapped the paper 3 times, short, long, short, and then looked up at her, my hand shaking. "Mom." I tapped out, the word feeling foreign on my fingers. It was the first time I had said it out loud in so long, the first time I had admitted the truth to anyone. Miss CB's face changed. She looked at me, her expression filled with concern, but also something else, something like understanding. She wrote something down quickly. "I'll help," she wrote. "Be careful. Act normal. Act." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what this meant, what she was going to do, but for the first time, I felt like someone cared. I felt like someone had seen me, really seen me, for the first time in my life. But as the days passed, I began to realize that this wasn't going to be easy. I had no idea how much trouble I was getting myself into. The silence that had ruled my life for so long was being challenged, and it terrified me. That evening, when I got home, I found my mother waiting for me in the kitchen. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, as she handed me a new set of rules. She had prepared for everything, and she would not let me escape. I had no choice but to follow her commands, to stay quiet, to stay hidden, and to live in the silence she demanded. The next day, Miss CB wasn't at school. She was gone. I didn't know where she had gone or why, but I knew something had changed. Something had shifted. And I couldn't tell anyone what had really happened. I couldn't tell anyone about the tapping, the Morse code, or the hope I had started to feel. But the silence was back. The fear was back. And I was trapped once again. Days blurred together as I tried to go about my routine. School was the only place where I could find some semblance of normality, but even that felt like a distant memory. Every day I fought the silence, the weight of it pressing on me, suffocating me. I couldn't stop thinking about Miss CB, her quiet note, and the hope she had sparked in me. But that hope, like everything else in my life, felt fleeting. My mother's presence loomed over me like a shadow, her control suffocating every moment, every breath. At school, I kept to myself, sitting alone in the cafeteria. The noise around me felt louder than ever, each conversation, every laugh, every clink of a fork on a plate, making my insides twist with unease. I had learned how to shut it all out. The louder the world around me became, the quieter I became inside. It was survival. It had to be. But one day, as I sat at my usual spot, I felt a presence beside me. I didn't look up, didn't acknowledge it. I knew it was Miss CB. I could feel her eyes on me, even though I refused to meet her gaze. I couldn't risk it. I had learned to avoid any kind of interaction, any kind of attention. But something was different this time. I felt her sitting beside me, waiting. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. How could she ask me that? How could anyone ask me that? I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay for as long as I could remember. But I couldn't tell her. I couldn't let her in. I had already pushed people away once, and I couldn't risk doing it again. So I said nothing. I just nodded, trying to force a smile. Miss CB didn't press the issue. She didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she sat quietly next to me, her presence a small comfort in a world that had been built on silence and fear. I didn't know what she was thinking. I didn't know if she truly understood what was going on, what I was living through, but her presence was a reminder that not everyone saw me as a problem, as something to be fixed. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely invisible. But that feeling was short-lived. As the day wore on, I noticed my mother's behavior growing more erratic. She was more watchful than usual, her eyes constantly scanning me, her grip tightening whenever I spoke. It was as if she knew something was off. I tried to act normal, to play my part, but the fear gnawed at me. She could see through my facade. She always could. That evening, as I sat at the dinner table, trying to chew my food as quietly as possible, I felt the tension in the air. My mother was watching me, her eyes narrowed, calculating. She said nothing, but the silence between us was thick with unspoken words. Every sound I made felt like an affront to her, every chew, every breath, felt like a violation of the rules she had set for me. The weight of her gaze was unbearable, and I had to fight not to break down right there. "Why aren't you eating?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp. "You've barely touched your food." I looked down at my plate, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just not hungry," I muttered, my throat tight with anxiety. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. She knew I was lying. She always did. Her hand reached out, pulling my plate closer to her, inspecting the food, as if she were trying to figure out why I wasn't eating. "You're always so difficult," she murmured under her breath, but I heard it. And it hurt. It stung in a way that words never had before. She wasn't just angry at me for not eating. She was angry at me for existing. Angry at me for being a child with needs, with desires, with a voice. I stayed silent. It was the only thing I could do. The only thing that would keep me safe. The next morning, I went to school, my stomach empty, my mind clouded with fear. I tried to focus on my classes, to push everything out of my head, but the thoughts wouldn't stop. The constant vigilance, the constant fear of making a mistake, of breaking the silence. How could I ever be free of it? But as the day wore on, I started to notice something strange. Miss CB was watching me. Again. But this time, there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't pity, it wasn't concern. It was something else, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't until after lunch that I finally got the courage to speak to her. I found her standing alone in the hallway, her back to the lockers, her arms crossed. I walked up to her, unsure of what to say. "Miss CB," I began, my voice shaky. "I don't know what to do anymore." She turned to me, her eyes softening. "You don't have to do anything," she said, her voice gentle. "You just have to let me help." I stared at her, unsure of what to think. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that someone was finally reaching out, that someone cared enough to see past the silence, to see past the walls I had built around myself. But I couldn't trust anyone. Not anymore. Not after everything my mother had done to me. "I can't trust anyone," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "I can't trust you." Miss CB took a step closer, her expression serious. "You don't have to trust me all at once," she said softly. "But you can trust that I won't give up on you." I felt a lump form in my throat. How could she say that? How could she be so sure? I had been let down so many times before. But there was something about the way she spoke, something about her unwavering kindness, that made me want to believe her. "I'm sorry," I muttered, turning away. "I have to go." But as I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Maybe not everything, maybe not right away, but something had shifted. Maybe Miss CB was the ally I needed. Maybe, for the first time, I wasn't entirely alone. The next few days felt like I was living in a fog, moving through the motions of school, home, and the ever-present silence that wrapped itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't know if it was the medication or the overwhelming stress of everything that had happened, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts were scattered, my body constantly tense, like I was waiting for something, anything, to break the endless quiet. Miss CB's presence at school continued to weigh on me, but this time, it wasn't just the guilt of not speaking up, it was the worry of what might happen next. After our brief conversation in the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me even more closely. I didn't know if it was paranoia or if she truly suspected something was wrong, but every time our paths crossed, I felt her eyes on me. It was like she was trying to figure me out, piece together the puzzle that had been my life for so long. I couldn't afford to let her see the cracks, the way I was falling apart. I had learned how to hold everything in, how to keep the facade up, how to smile and act like everything was okay when it was anything but the pressure was building. My mother's control, her constant need to monitor every aspect of my life, was starting to feel like a weight I couldn't bear anymore. At home, things were becoming more unbearable. The point system, which had been a twisted form of control, was still in full effect. Every day was about earning points, about surviving without triggering my mother's wrath. Food, silence, my every movement, all of it was a calculation. If I made noise, if I broke the rules, there would be consequences. I lived in constant fear of slipping up, of doing something that would make my mother punish me. One night, as I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. My mother was walking down the hall, her shoes clicking on the wooden floor. I held my breath, willing myself to stay still, not to make a sound. I knew that if she heard me, if she noticed I was awake, it would be another strike against me. The footsteps stopped outside my door. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the door creaked open just a little, and I saw the faint outline of my mother standing there. She didn't say anything, didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me. I knew she was watching, waiting for me to break. But I didn't. I held my breath, kept my body rigid, and waited for her to leave. After what felt like an eternity, she finally turned and walked away. The door clicked shut softly behind her, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I couldn't understand what it was she was looking for. What did she expect from me? What did she want me to do? I had been silent for so long, had obeyed her every command, and yet, it was never enough. It was never good enough. The next day, when I got home from school, the tension was palpable. I could feel it in the air, like the calm before a storm. My mother was waiting for me in the living room, her eyes sharp, calculating. She didn't greet me when I walked in. Instead, she motioned for me to sit down. "You've been acting strange lately," she said, her voice low but steady. "What's going on? Why aren't you eating? Why aren't you following the rules?" I didn't know what to say. The words were stuck in my throat, tangled up with fear. I wanted to tell her everything, how I was suffocating, how I was scared to even breathe in my own home, how the silence had become my prison. But I couldn't. I had learned the hard way that speaking up only made things worse. So, I stayed quiet, just like I always did. "I'm fine," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't buy it. I could see the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "I'm not stupid. I know something's wrong. There's news to Elentidnak." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she was the reason everything was wrong, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I just nodded and sat there, trapped in the silence she had created. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "You're going to start therapy," she said, her tone final. I'm not going to have you continue like this. If you don't start cooperating, I'll have no choice but to take more drastic measures." I didn't know what she meant by drastic measures, but the fear in her eyes told me that whatever it was going to be worse than anything I had experienced before. The thought of going to therapy made my stomach twist. I couldn't imagine sitting in a room, talking about my life, my pain. I had learned long ago that it was safer to keep everything inside, to stay silent. But my mother wasn't giving me a choice. She was pushing me into a corner, forcing me to face the very thing I had spent years avoiding. The following days were a blur of therapy appointments and more rules. My mother had arranged for me to see a therapist, Dr. Klaus, a doctor who specialized in children with difficult behaviors. The first session was the worst. I sat in a sterile office, my hands folded tightly in my lap, as my mother explained my behavioral issues to Dr. Klaus. She painted a picture of me as a troubled child, one who was manipulative and defiant. She didn't mention the real reason behind my silence, the fear that controlled every aspect of my life. Dr. Klaus looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. "So, you're having trouble following the rules at home?" he asked, his voice clinical, detached. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was too terrified to speak. My mother took the lead, explaining how she had to control every aspect of my life. How I needed therapy to correct my behavior. How I needed medication to make me more manageable. I felt a lump form in my throat, the familiar taste of hopelessness filling my mouth. I wanted to scream, to tell them everything. But I couldn't. My voice was locked inside, buried beneath the silence I had learned to live with. When the session was over, my mother took me home, her grip tight on my arm as she led me to the car. She didn't speak during the drive. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, her eyes constantly watching, waiting for me to slip up, to break. That night, when I was lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something was coming, something worse than anything I had experienced before. I could feel it in my bones, in the tension that hung in the air. It was like the calm before the storm, and I didn't know how much longer I could survive in the silence. The days that followed were a blur of appointments, silence, and fear. My mother continued to tighten her grip on me, pushing me further into a corner, forcing me to comply with every rule, every request, no matter how ridiculous or painful. Each new restriction, each new demand, felt like another chain being added to the prison that had become my life. Therapy was now a weekly ordeal, and every time I walked into that sterile office, the walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier with each passing minute. Dr. Klaus was a distant figure, his professional detachment never quite masking the undercurrent of suspicion that always lingered in the air. My mother's well-practiced narrative of my supposed behavioral issues seemed to work perfectly in her favor. She painted me as a problem child, one who was manipulative, attention-seeking, and unable to control herself. She never mentioned the real reason I was so silent, the suffocating control she held over me, the way she had manipulated every situation to keep me in check. I tried to tell Dr. Klaus the truth, but each time the words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't explain it, how could I? The years of silence had made me mute in more ways than one. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, I could feel the weight of my mother's presence behind me, her judgment looming, waiting for me to slip up. During one particular session, as my mother sat beside me, she began explaining the treatment plan she had devised for me. She spoke with such conviction, such authority, that I almost believed her. Almost. She mentioned how I had been prescribed medication to help control my disruptive behavior, how she had removed all the distractions from my life, like TV and music, to create a more controlled environment for me. She described how she had set up a structured routine at home to help me focus, to correct my behavior. I wanted to speak up, to tell Dr. Klaus how this wasn't treatment, how this was manipulation, but my throat constricted, and the words never came. Instead, I sat there, silently enduring my mother's lies. She made it sound so reasonable, so believable, that I almost began to doubt my own reality. Was I really the problem? Was I really as bad as she said I was? The hardest part of these sessions wasn't the therapy itself, it was the aftermath. Every time we left Dr. Klaus's office, my mother's grip on me tightened. She would demand that I perform better, that I follow the rules more closely. She would tell me how proud she was of my progress, how I was finally starting to improve. But her praise always came with strings attached. It was never enough. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how quiet I became, there was always something else I had to do, something else I had to prove to her. It wasn't long before I began to notice something that scared me more than anything else, the way my body was changing. I wasn't eating enough, I wasn't sleeping enough, and the medication was making everything worse. My mind felt foggy, detached. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't think straight. I had no energy, no will to do anything except survive the next moment. At school, I started to become a ghost. I was barely there, barely present in my own life. My classmates noticed the changes, the way I had withdrawn, the way I barely spoke anymore. They didn't know what was happening, but they could see it. They saw the hollow look in my eyes, the way I seemed to shrink further and further into myself. I stopped going to the bathroom between classes. I stopped eating lunch. I stopped participating in anything that required me to speak, to be seen. My world had shrunk to the walls of my home, the confines of my mother's control, and the empty, silent spaces between therapy sessions. But then something happened that I didn't expect. Miss CB, the substitute teacher who had once shown me kindness, was back. I saw her in the hallway one day after class, her eyes meeting mine for the first time in weeks. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of what had been happening to me. I wanted to run, to hide, but she stepped forward, blocking my path. "Are you okay?" she asked again, her voice gentle but insistent. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to cry, to scream, to let the truth spill out and finally be heard. But I couldn't. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk the fallout, the consequences of breaking the silence. "I'm fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Miss CB didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. She didn't push, but she didn't walk away either. She just stood there, her presence a silent invitation to speak, to trust her. I turned away, not knowing what else to say. The fear inside me was too overwhelming. I couldn't trust anyone. Not anymore. That night, when I got home, things were worse than ever. My mother was waiting for me in the living room, her eyes cold, calculating. She had been watching me, tracking my every movement. I could see it in the way she looked at me, in the way she spoke to me. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it, too. "You're slipping," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You're not following the rules anymore. You're not trying hard enough." I tried to stay calm, to keep my breathing steady, but inside, I was falling apart. I had no idea what to do anymore. I had no idea how to escape the web she had trapped me in. "You'll be sorry," she said, her voice tightening. "I'm not going to let you ruin everything we've worked for." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle on my chest. There was no escape. There was no way out. I was trapped, and the walls were closing in on me. Days bled into one another in a haze of numbness and medication. The fog in my mind grew thicker, the sounds of the world outside my head growing more distant with every passing hour. At school, the other kids barely noticed. They had their own lives, their own problems, their own voices to fill the air. And I just became quieter. My existence was reduced to the space I occupied, nothing more, nothing less. I sat at my desk, my head down, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to become invisible. Every time the bell rang, signaling the end of class, I would gather my books and shuffle out of the room, head down, eyes to the floor. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't look at anyone. I wasn't there, not really. I was just a shell, a body moving through space, doing what was required to survive. But something started to change. It was subtle at first, like a small crack in the foundation of the life I had built for myself. Miss CB, The one teacher who had once seemed to notice me began watching me more closely. Every time I glanced up, I caught her looking in my direction, her gaze not judgmental but curious. She seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for me to speak, to tell her what had been happening. One day, after a particularly quiet lunch in the cafeteria, I saw her standing near the door, her eyes scanning the room, searching for someone. And then, her gaze locked with mine. I froze. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to be seen. But Miss CB wasn't going to let me off the hook that easily. She walked over to me, her footsteps deliberate. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me, her eyes soft but filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Come with me," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. I wanted to protest, to tell her I couldn't, that I didn't want to go anywhere with her. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me, and followed her. She led me out of the cafeteria, down the hall, and into a small, empty classroom. The door closed behind us with a soft click, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I stood by the desk, my hands trembling. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had no idea what was happening, no idea what she wanted from me, but I could feel the tension building between us, like a live wire waiting to snap. Miss CB didn't sit down. Instead, she stood there, her hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes were kind but searching. "I know something is wrong," she said softly. "And I think you know I'm not going to leave you alone until you tell me." I wanted to break down, to confess everything, to tell her about my mother, about the control, the manipulation, the silence. But I couldn't. It felt too big, too much. I had kept it all inside for so long, had buried it so deep, that even the thought of speaking it out loud terrified me. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I can't tell you." Miss CB took a step closer, her gaze steady, unwavering. "You don't have to tell me everything. But you can start somewhere. You can start by telling me what's going on with you, what's really happening at home." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. For a moment, I thought I might speak. I thought the words might come rushing out in a torrent, everything I had been holding in for so long. But then, I remembered my mother, her control, her manipulation. I remembered how she had silenced me, how she had made me believe that I was the problem, that I was the one who needed fixing. "I can't," I said again, shaking my head, my eyes squeezed shut in an effort to hold back the tears. Miss CB didn't push further. She simply nodded, as if she understood. "I'm not going to force you to speak. But I want you to know that I'm here. And if you ever want to talk, if you ever want to tell someone what's happening, I'll be here. You're not alone." I nodded, but it wasn't a real nod. It wasn't an acknowledgement of her words. It was a way to escape, to avoid the truth that was bubbling up inside me. That afternoon, when I returned home, I found my mother waiting for me in the living room. The atmosphere was thick with tension. I could feel it in my bones, the weight of her gaze on me. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. I could see it in her eyes, the disappointment, the anger, the expectation that I would comply. I sat down, my body stiff, my hands folded in my lap. "You've been acting out," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "I know you've been seeing that therapist. And I know you've been talking to her. I told you what would happen if you didn't follow the rules." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I couldn't argue with her. I couldn't tell her that she was the problem, that she was the one who had made me into this person. It didn't matter. She would never listen. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "I don't want to hear about you acting out again. Do you understand me?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For the next few days, things got worse. My mother increased the pressure. She controlled every aspect of my life with an iron fist. I wasn't allowed to go outside unless she was with me. I wasn't allowed to speak to anyone without her permission. She scrutinized every word I said, every movement I made, as if I was a prisoner in my own home. The therapy sessions continued, but they were becoming increasingly pointless. I had learned to keep everything inside, to say nothing. I had learned to be quiet, to disappear into the silence. But the silence was no longer my refuge, it was my cage. One evening, I was sitting in my room, staring at the walls, when I heard the familiar sound of my mother's footsteps outside my door. I knew what was coming. I knew that the silence would break, that the pressure would rise again. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to keep quiet much longer. It felt like every part of my life was unraveling at the seams. The pressure, the constant surveillance, the weight of my mother's control, it all seemed unbearable. At school, I was becoming more of a ghost. I moved through the halls unnoticed, blending into the walls, staying out of people's way. The only time I felt even remotely alive was during the brief moments when I would catch Miss CB's eye. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, she would be the one to help me escape this nightmare. But those moments were growing fewer and fewer. My mother continued to tighten her grip. She wouldn't let me leave the house unless it was to go to therapy, and even then, she was always right there, watching me, her eyes constantly searching for any sign of defiance, any indication that I was starting to break free from her control. And I could feel it happening, slowly but surely. My body was rejecting the routine she had set for me. I was becoming weaker, exhausted, more disoriented. The medication she had me on was fogging my mind, draining my energy. But even through the haze, I could feel the walls closing in, could feel myself slipping further away from any hope of freedom. Then one day, something changed. It was subtle at first, but I felt it deep within me. There was a shift in the air, a crack in the foundation of everything I had built to survive. I was sitting in the cafeteria, staring blankly at my food, when I saw Miss CB walking toward me. This time, she didn't wait for me to speak or make eye contact. She simply sat down across from me, her presence solid and unwavering. "I'm not going to stop," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's happening, but I know it's not right. I can't let you keep living like this." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen through the mask I had put on. Someone had noticed the cracks I had tried so hard to hide. I wanted to speak, to tell her everything that had been happening at home, everything that my mother had done to me. But I couldn't. The fear of what might happen if I did was too great. "I can't," I said, my voice barely audible. "I can't tell you. I can't tell anyone." Miss CB didn't press me further. She just sat there, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, concern, maybe, or determination. She had seen through my silence. She had seen the truth behind my mask. And that scared me more than anything else. "Just know that you don't have to go through this alone," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm here. I won't let you be alone in this." "Very wan become saddened and isi yuju." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say, how to explain what was happening. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. Someone had seen me. Someone had noticed. That night, when I got home, I expected the usual, the tension in the air, my mother's eyes watching me, waiting for any sign of weakness. But something was different. She was still there, still controlling every aspect of my life, but there was a shift in the way I viewed it. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about something more. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep existing in the silence, in the fear. I needed to find a way out. And for the first time, I had a plan. It wasn't fully formed, and I didn't know how I was going to execute it, but I knew one thing. I couldn't do it alone. I had to rely on the people who had seen through the lies, who had noticed the cracks in my armor. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would start finding a way out. I wouldn't let my mother's control define me anymore. I wouldn't let the silence suffocate me. I would find a way to speak, to break free, and to take back my life. The next day at school, I saw Miss CB again. This time, I didn't wait for her to approach me. I walked up to her, my heart racing, my mind filled with 100 different thoughts. "I need your help," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that churned in my stomach. I need to get out of my house. I can't keep living like this. Miss CB's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything at first. She just nodded slowly, her expression serious. I'll help you, she said, her voice firm. We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone had my back. Someone was willing to help me fight for my freedom, to fight for my life. The weight of the silence, the control, the fear, it didn't go away, not right away. But with Miss CB's help, with the support of those who cared, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had a chance. That night, I didn't go straight to my room when I got home. Instead, I went to the kitchen, where my mother was preparing dinner. She didn't notice me at first, and for a brief moment, I thought about running. I thought about leaving, about walking out the door and never coming back. But the fear of what she would do if I left held me in place. I walked to the table, where my mother had placed my plate. It was the same as always, dry, overcooked meat with a few vegetables on the side. But this time, I didn't feel the usual fear that gripped me. I didn't feel the weight of her watchful gaze. I didn't feel like I had to eat every bite, to do everything she said. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was trapped. Why aren't you eating? My mother asked, her voice sharp. I looked at her, trying to summon the courage to speak, to tell her everything that had been building inside me. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I picked up my fork and began eating, silently, mechanically, just like I always had. But this time, it was different. I wasn't eating to survive anymore. I was eating to plan my escape. The silence was still there, still suffocating, still controlling. But I knew now that it wouldn't last forever. I had a way out, and I was going to take it. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but I would break free. And when I did, I would no longer be a prisoner in my own life. It felt like something was shifting inside me. The walls I had built around myself were starting to crack, and for the first time in years, I could see the light shining through. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was starting to fight back. That night, after dinner, I sat in my room, my mind racing. My mother hadn't said anything about my lack of enthusiasm, about how I hadn't eaten much. I had expected her to punish me, to scream at me for not following the rules, for not behaving the way she wanted me to. But instead, she had just left me alone. For the first time in a long time, I felt a small flicker of hope. The silence in the house felt different now. It wasn't as oppressive. It wasn't as suffocating. I could breathe, just a little. And I could think clearly. I knew what I had to do. I had to get out. The plan had begun to take shape, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. My mother's control had been so deeply entrenched in my life that breaking free from it would require more than just walking out the door. But Miss CB had given me a glimpse of what was possible. She had seen me, had recognized the fear and the pain I had been hiding for so long. And now, I wasn't alone in this anymore. I knew I had to be careful. My mother was always watching, always waiting for me to slip up. She would be looking for any sign that I was planning to escape. So, I kept quiet. I kept my movements small, my actions calculated. I didn't want to raise any suspicion. But as the days passed, the anxiety in my chest grew. It felt like a countdown, like I was running out of time before my mother would figure out what I was doing. And then, one day, it happened. I was sitting in the library, staring blankly at my homework, when I saw her. Miss CB was standing in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't looking at me directly, but I could feel her presence, like a weight settling on my shoulders. My heart started to race, and I tried to look away, tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible. She walked over to me, her footsteps quiet on the floor. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if she was going to confront me, to ask me more questions, to press me about what had been happening. But instead, she sat down next to me, her voice low and calm. "You've been quiet," she said, her eyes studying me. "Too quiet. And I know why." I froze, the words catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. "I don't know what you mean," I whispered, my voice shaky. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, like she could see right through me, like she knew exactly what I had been planning. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like everything around us had disappeared, and it was just the two of us in that quiet room. And then, she spoke. "Your mother," Miss CB said, her voice soft but firm. "She's not going to let you go without a fight. But you don't have to keep living like this. I can help you." The words hit me like a wave, crashing over me, sweeping away the fear that had been holding me in place. I wanted to tell her everything, to let her in, to finally speak the truth that had been buried so deep inside me. But I couldn't. I couldn't let her see how terrified I was, how much I still feared my mother's control. "I can't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't leave her. She'll never let me go." Miss CB didn't push me. She just nodded, her eyes understanding, like she knew exactly what I was going through. "You don't have to do this alone," she said gently. "But you have to take the first step. You have to be ready to fight." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. The fear was still there, gnawing at me, but there was something else too, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The smallest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could escape this prison I had been living in. "I'm ready," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. But as soon as they left my mouth, I knew they were true. I was ready. Ready to fight. Ready to take back my life. The next few days felt like they moved in slow motion. I couldn't tell anyone what was happening, couldn't risk letting my mother know that I was planning to escape. But every night, when I lay in bed, I felt the weight of the plan settling on me. I was going to do it. I was going to leave. That morning, when I got up, I felt the change. I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about taking control of my life. I walked into the kitchen with a newfound sense of purpose, ready to face my mother. But she wasn't there. She was gone. For the first time in years, I was alone in the house. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was liberating. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the bag I had packed the night before, the one with the essentials clothes, a few personal items, and the one thing I knew I couldn't leave behind, the letter from Miss CB. The letter that had given me the courage to believe that I could escape, that I could break free. I took one last look around the house, the place that had held me captive for so long. It had been my prison, but now it was just a house. A place I was leaving behind. And then, I walked out the door. The cool morning air hit me like a wave as I stepped out of the house. I had no plan, no clear path ahead, but at that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in my life, I was outside my mother's grip, and that was all that mattered. The world outside felt different, open, vast, and terrifying all at once. But there was something thrilling in the unknown, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. The weight I had been carrying on my shoulders was finally lifting, even if just for a moment. I didn't know where to go, what to do, but I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't let my mother's control pull me back into the suffocating silence. I walked briskly, my footsteps echoing on the pavement, my mind racing. The only thing I could focus on was putting distance between myself and the house, the place where I had been a prisoner for so long. I had no phone, no money, no clear plan, but I did have the letter from Miss CB. I hadn't told anyone about the plan, not even her, but I knew she would help. She had said she would. I just had to find her, find someone who could help me, someone who would understand that I couldn't go back, not now. I kept walking. The city streets unfamiliar but somehow comforting. I felt the rush of adrenaline pumping through my veins as I walked farther from my old life, my past, my mother's control. The quiet, suffocating atmosphere I had lived in was slowly replaced by the hum of life, the sound of people going about their day, cars passing by, the distant chatter of pedestrians. It felt like a new world, a world where I could breathe again. Hours passed, and I still had no destination in mind. I found myself standing at the edge of a park, staring at the open green space before me. It was peaceful here, quiet but not suffocating. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I sat down on a bench, trying to collect my thoughts, but as I sat there, the weight of my decision began to sink in. What was I doing? Where was I going to go? What would happen to me now that I had left everything behind? The fear crept in, the fear of being caught, of being found. I had no idea where to go, no idea what would happen next. I had just taken the first step, but I had no clear path forward. I pulled the letter from Miss Seeby out of my bag, unfolding it carefully. Her handwriting was neat, precise, and for some reason, just reading her words made me feel a little less alone. It was a reminder that someone cared, that someone believed I could escape, that someone believed in my ability to break free. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them clear. But then I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was just a man, a stranger, walking his dog. He glanced at me, offering a polite smile, before continuing on his way. I looked down at the letter again, my hands trembling. What was I waiting for? What was I so afraid of? I had made it this far. I had escaped the prison my mother had built for me, and now it was time to make the next move. But as I stood up, ready to leave the park and figure out what to do next, something stopped me. A car. It pulled up to the curb, a familiar black sedan. My heart skipped a beat, my body stiffened. I didn't need to see the face of the driver to know who it was. My mother. I froze, caught between the urge to run and the reality that she had found me. How did she know where I was? How did she track me down so quickly? The fear surged through me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I thought I might crumble right there. The car stopped in front of me, and the door opened. My mother stepped out, her face a mask of calm, but I could see the anger in her eyes, the determination. She wasn't going to let me go. Not now, not ever. Get in the car, she said, her voice cold, commanding. I didn't move. I couldn't. The fear, the terror, the weight of everything I had run from crashed down on me in that moment. I was trapped. I was back where I started, caught between my desire for freedom and my mother's iron grip on my life. But something inside me snapped. I had already taken the first step. I couldn't go back. I wouldn't go back. No, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. I'm not going back with you. My mother's face twisted with rage, but I stood my ground. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a choice. I wasn't going to let her control me anymore. I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the silence. Don't be stupid, she hissed. Get in the car now, or I'll make you regret it. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on hers. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my resolve was steady. I'm not going back, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper but full of defiance. For a long moment, we just stood there, facing each other. And then, my mother did something I hadn't expected. She turned and walked back to the car, her heels clicking on the pavement as she climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The car drove off, leaving me standing there, breathless and shaken. But I wasn't scared anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't scared. I was free. I didn't know where I would go or what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never let my mother control me again. I was going to take control of my life, and nothing was going to stop me. I stood in the park for a long time after my mother's car drove away. The world felt different now, like a weight had been lifted off my chest, but it wasn't the relief I expected. It wasn't freedom in the way I thought it would be. It was raw, uncharted territory, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. For a moment, I almost felt like I had made a mistake. Maybe I should have gotten in the car. Maybe I should have gone back to the safety of the house, the prison I knew, the rules that had kept me in check for so long. But that thought didn't last. I wasn't a prisoner anymore. I took a deep breath and pulled my phone out of my pocket. I had no idea who to contact, who would help me. There was no one left in my life who I could trust completely, But there was one person who had made me believe that escaping my mother's control was possible, Miss CB. I pulled up her contact information and hesitated. It had been weeks since we had spoken directly, but I knew she was the one person who could help me now. I dialed her number and waited, my heart pounding in my chest as I heard the ringing on the other end. Each passing second felt like a small eternity, but then, the call connected. "Hello?" She answered, her voice calm and reassuring. "Miss CB." I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's me. I need your help." The pause on the other end felt endless. I could feel her processing what I had just said, trying to gauge the gravity of the situation. "What happened?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm safe," I said quickly, trying to steady my breath. I left. I couldn't stay. My mother. She tried to stop me." "Where are you now?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm in the park," I said, my eyes scanning my surroundings, not really sure what to do next. "I don't know where to go. I don't know who to trust. I just need help." "You're not alone," she said softly. "Stay where you are, I'll come get you." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the tension in my body loosening just a little. Miss CB was on her way. I wasn't alone anymore. The minutes felt like hours as I waited in the park, watching the world move around me, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded in my life. The weight of what I had just done, of what I was about to do, was slowly starting to sink in. I had no idea what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't go back. It wasn't long before I saw her car pull into the parking lot. Miss CB's face appeared in the window as she parked, her eyes scanning the park before landing on me. When I saw her, I felt something in my chest loosen, something I hadn't realized had been tight all along. It was relief, yes, but also something else: hope. I hurried over to the car and climbed into the passenger seat. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was where I was supposed to be. "Are you okay?" Miss CB asked as she started the car and pulled away from the curb. Her eyes were focused on the road, but her voice held an undercurrent of concern. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel scared. I feel like I'm about to lose everything, but at the same time, I know I can't go back." She nodded, her expression serious. "It's going to be okay," she said, her voice steady. "You've made it this far. You're strong enough to keep going. But you don't have to do this alone. You can system stably in." I looked out the window, the streets passing by in a blur, my mind spinning. The uncertainty of it all was overwhelming. What would I do now? Where would I go? Could I really leave my mother behind for good? But as Miss CB drove, I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't have to have all the answers. I didn't have to know what was going to happen next. All I had to do was trust her, trust that she would help me, trust that I wasn't alone in this fight. As the city passed by, I thought about the life I had left behind, the life of fear and silence, of being controlled by someone who couldn't see me for who I truly was. But that life wasn't mine anymore. I had stepped away from it. I had chosen my own path. And no matter what happened next, I would never let anyone take that from me again. "We'll find a place for you to stay," Miss CB said as she glanced at me. "You'll be safe. I know someone who can help. We'll get you out of this mess." I nodded, a small but genuine smile forming on my face. "Thank you," I whispered, "for believing in me." She smiled back, her eyes soft with reassurance. "You're stronger than you think." The car drove on, the city fading behind us, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could start over. I could build a new life, free from the chains of my past. And that was the most terrifying and liberating feeling of all. The ride felt longer than it actually was. The city passed in a blur of unfamiliar streets, the lights and sounds of the world outside contrasting sharply with the silence that had always defined my life. I had spent so many years trying to become invisible, trying to shrink into the background. But now, As the car moved further from the life I had known, I felt the weight of that silence starting to lift, just a little. I sat in the passenger seat, trying to steady my breathing, trying to focus on the road ahead. It was strange, feeling like the weight of the world was both behind me and ahead of me. I didn't know what was coming, didn't know where I was headed or what would happen when we reached our destination, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of excitement. Where are we going? I finally asked, breaking the silence between us. To a friend of mine's place, Miss CB replied, her voice calm and reassuring. She's got an apartment, and she's offered to let you stay there until we can figure things out. It's not much, but it's safe. I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. A safe place. That was all I needed right now. Somewhere to be, somewhere to breathe, away from the control, away from the fear. But even as the words settled in my mind, the doubt crept in. Was I really going to be safe? Was there truly a way out of all of this? Or was this just another temporary escape, one that would eventually come crashing down, just like everything else in my life? I know it's scary, Miss CB said, as if reading my thoughts. But you're not going through this alone. We're going to figure it out, step by step. Her words brought a small sense of comfort, but the fear was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. What if my mother found me? What if she came after me, dragged me back into that life of control and silence? What if, after all this, I was left with nothing? But as the car slowed to a stop and Miss CB turned off the engine, I realized something. I had already done the hardest part. I had taken the first step. I had left. I had fought back. And that in itself was a victory, no matter what came next. We stepped out of the car, and Miss CB led me to a small apartment building. It was quiet here, tucked away from the noise and chaos of the city, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm as we entered the building and made our way to the apartment. When we reached the door, Miss CB knocked softly, and after a moment, the door swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, her expression warm and welcoming. "You must be the one Miss CB was talking about," the woman said with a soft smile. "Come on in." I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a soft click. The apartment was modest, but it felt different from anything I had ever known. There was warmth here, light streaming through the windows, plants in the corners, soft music playing in the background. It was peaceful. It was a place where I could breathe. The woman introduced herself as Emily, and after a few minutes of conversation, she showed me to the spare bedroom. "You can stay here for as long as you need," she said, her voice kind and sincere. "We'll figure everything out." I sat down on the bed, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. The room was simple, but it was mine. I wasn't in my mother's house anymore. I wasn't under her control. I was free, but freedom, I quickly learned, wasn't as easy as just stepping out of the cage. It was a process. A long one. The next few days were a whirlwind. Miss CB stayed in contact with me, checking in regularly, making sure I was okay. Emily, too, was kind and understanding, giving me space to settle in while also offering to help in any way she could. I spent most of my time in the small apartment, adjusting to my new life, trying to figure out what my next step was. I had no job, no plan, no way to support myself. But there was something different now. I wasn't alone. I wasn't trapped. I had options. And I had people who cared about me, people who saw me, who didn't want to control me, but wanted to help me grow. One day, after a long conversation with Miss CB, I made a decision. I would go back to school. I would finish my education, and I would start working toward a future for myself, one that was mine to control, not anyone else's. The idea of going back to school felt daunting. I hadn't been there in months, and I wasn't sure how I would fit in or whether I could even handle the pressure. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the right choice. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building a life that I could be proud of. A life where I didn't have to hide, where I could speak and live on my own terms. I spent the next few weeks settling into this new life. Emily helped me with the basics, finding a part-time job, getting my school transcripts, and helping me navigate the paperwork of getting back into school. Miss CB was a constant support, making sure I had everything I needed, offering advice, and checking in whenever I felt overwhelmed. The silence that had once defined my life still lingered, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't a suffocating silence anymore. It was the quiet of a new beginning, the calm before the storm of building a life from the ground up. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, working on some homework, I looked out the window at the city skyline. I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't trapped. The world was big, and there were so many possibilities ahead of me. I had a future now, one that I would create on my own terms. For the first time in years, I felt hope. And that hope was the first real step toward rebuilding my life. As the days passed, I slowly started to feel more at home in my new life. The apartment had become my sanctuary, the place where I could finally breathe, think, and be myself without fear of reprisal. Emily had become not just a temporary benefactor but a friend, a real one. She wasn't trying to control me or make me into something I wasn't. She offered support, but also gave me the space I needed to grow and heal. Miss CB, too, had become a constant, checking in on me when I needed it and offering guidance as I figured out what my next steps would be. But even with all the support around me, there were still days when the silence crept back in, when I found myself sitting alone in the room, my thoughts consuming me. Some nights, I would lie awake in bed, my mind racing with doubts. Was this all really happening? Was I truly free, or was I simply running away from a life I wasn't ready to face? It was during one of these sleepless nights that I found myself standing by the window, staring out at the city below. The lights from the streets flickered like distant stars, and the hum of traffic seemed to pulse through the air. The noise of the city, something I had once feared, something that had always seemed so overwhelming, now felt strangely comforting. It was proof that the world was moving, that there was life beyond the walls I had confined myself to for so long. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air against my skin. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first stepped out of my mother's house. Back then, I was just surviving, trying to stay under the radar, keeping my head down. But now, something was changing inside me. I was starting to see the world in a different way. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't someone who had to hide in the shadows. I could be seen. I could speak. I could be heard. And with that realization, something shifted within me. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to take control of my voice. I wasn't going to hide from my past anymore. I had spent so many years silencing myself, letting fear control me, letting the weight of my mother's demands dictate how I lived. But that was over. I was going to speak. I was going to share my story, not as a victim, but as someone who had fought back, who had survived, and who was rebuilding her life. I reached out to Miss CB and told her what I was planning. She was immediately supportive, urging me to share my experience in a way that could help others, to give a voice to those who might feel just as trapped as I had been. I had no idea how I would do it, how I would even begin to share my story, but I knew it was time. I started small. I wrote in a journal at first, jotting down thoughts, memories, pieces of my past that had always felt too heavy to face. As I wrote, I began to feel a sense of release, as if the act of putting my thoughts into words was lifting some of the weight off my shoulders. Each word was a small victory, a step toward healing. One day, I decided to take it a step further. I sat in front of my laptop, my hands hovering over the keyboard. I had never been the type to write publicly. I had never shared my feelings with anyone outside the walls of my own mind. But now, I wanted to. I needed to. I opened a blank document and began typing. The words came slower at first, tentative, unsure. But soon, they flowed, a torrent of emotions spilling out onto the screen. I didn't edit myself, didn't worry about whether it sounded perfect. I just wrote. I wrote about the fear, about my mother's control, about the silence that had suffocated me for so long. I wrote about the moment I had walked out of that house, about the relief and the terror that had flooded me all at once. I wrote about how I was still learning to live, still learning to speak, still learning to trust. When I finished, I sat back and stared at the screen. The document was filled with raw emotion, with words I had never said aloud. It was a story I had never told anyone, not even Miss CB. And yet, in that moment, I felt like I had finally let go of something that had been weighing me down for years. I saved the document, but I didn't post it. Not yet. But the idea was there. I had shared my story with myself, and it was only a matter of time before I shared it with the world. Over the next few weeks, I began to take small steps toward reclaiming my voice. I started going back to school, meeting with teachers and classmates, trying to re-enter the world I had so long avoided. I got a part-time job at a local cafe, something simple, but it felt like another way of building my independence, proving to myself that I could stand on my own. But the silence, the fear, was still there. It would take time to fully shake it off. It would take time to learn how to trust again, to find my place in a world that had once seemed so overwhelming. One afternoon, as I sat in the cafe during a break, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message from Miss CB. But instead, it was an email. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The subject line read, "You are not alone." I opened the message and read the words. It was from a woman who had found my story online. She had been through something similar, living in a controlling, abusive environment, silenced by fear and manipulation. She thanked me for sharing my story, telling me that it had given her the courage to take her first step toward freedom. Her message was short, but it hit me harder than anything I had ever read. It was a reminder that my voice had power. It wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who had been silenced, anyone who had been made to feel invisible. I sat there for a long time, staring at the email, letting the weight of it sink in. This was why I had fought so hard. This was why I had broken free to help others, to give them the strength to do the same. And in that moment, I realized something else. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was helping others rebuild theirs too. Together we could break the silence. Together we could find our voices. The weeks that followed were a blur of change, small victories, and moments of doubt. Each day felt like a new beginning, yet also like a continuation of a long journey. I had taken the first step out of my mother's house, but I knew that escaping wasn't the end of my battle. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was just the start of something new, something terrifying, and something completely uncertain. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how to rebuild my life, how to take back the pieces of me that had been stolen over the years, or how to overcome the fear that still whispered in my mind every time I made a decision. But what I did have was a newfound sense of freedom, a small spark of independence, and people who believed in me. Miss CB had been the pillar of support I didn't know I needed. She wasn't just a teacher or a mentor, she was a lifeline. Someone who had reached out to me when I felt like I had no one else. Her faith in me had given me the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, even when it felt like everything was stacked against me. As I settled into my new life, I began to realize that rebuilding wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't something that could be done in days or weeks, it was a process. Each day, I worked at it. I worked at learning how to trust again, how to navigate a world that had once felt so alien to me, how to find my place in a life that had once been filled with silence. I kept writing. The journal entries had turned into a kind of therapy, a way for me to process everything that had happened, everything I was still going through. Sometimes, I'd write about the pain of my past, about my mother's control, about the fear that had shaped my life. Other times, I wrote about my future, the goals I had, the steps I was taking, and the things I wanted to accomplish. But the most important thing I wrote about was myself. For the first time, I wrote for me, not for anyone else, not to meet anyone's expectations, but to figure out who I really was, beyond the control, beyond the silence. One evening, I sat at my desk in the apartment, a cup of tea in front of me, my laptop open, when I heard a knock on the door. It was soft, tentative, almost hesitant. I stood up, wondering who it could be, and opened the door to find Emily standing there, her expression serious but kind. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low. "It's important." My heart skipped a beat. Was something wrong? Had my mother found me? The fear surged through me, the old instincts kicking in. But I took a deep breath and stepped aside to let her in. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily sat down on the couch and looked at me, her eyes searching. "I've been talking to Miss CB," she said slowly, "and we think it's time for you to start thinking about what's next. Not just surviving, but building a future. A real one. A life that's yours and yours alone." I sat down across from her, my heart pounding. "What do you mean? I don't even know where to start." Emily smiled gently. "We're going to help you figure that out. We think you should think about going to college, getting a degree. It's not going to be easy, but we believe in you. You've already proven that you're strong enough to make it this far. Now it's time to build the future you deserve." I blinked, stunned. College. It felt like an impossible dream, something that belonged to a different version of me, someone who had never been trapped in fear, someone who had never had to fight for every breath. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This was my chance to build something for myself. To prove that I wasn't just a product of my past, but someone capable of shaping my own future. "I don't know if I can do it," I admitted, the doubt creeping in again. "I've been so focused on surviving that I haven't thought about anything beyond that." "You've got the power to change your future," Emily said, her voice firm. "I know it's scary, but you've already taken the hardest steps. You've walked away from everything you've known. And now you've got people who care about you, people who will help you every step of the way." I didn't respond at first. I just sat there, letting her words sink in. It felt like the door to a whole new world was opening in front of me, and all I had to do was walk through it. But it wasn't that simple, was it? Nothing had been simple for me in years. But Emily was right. I had already walked through one door, one that led me away from my mother's control, one that had given me the chance to live for myself. And if I could do that, if I could make it this far, then I had the strength to take the next step. "What's the next step?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We start planning," Emily said with a smile. "We figure out what you need to do to apply, to get into school, to get your life on track. You've already got a start, your determination, your strength. Now we just need to take it one step at a time." It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. The fear, the uncertainty, would always be there. But now, it didn't feel like a weight I had to carry alone. I had people in my corner, people who believed in me, who saw something in me that I couldn't see myself. As the days passed, I began to feel the pieces of my life falling into place. I started looking into colleges, applying for scholarships, and working toward building a future that was mine. It wasn't perfect, and I still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something. I was taking control of my future, one decision at a time. And with each step I took, the silence that had once defined my life began to fade into the background. I was no longer defined by the fear that had held me captive for so long. I was no longer invisible. I was speaking my truth, and I was building a life that was mine to control. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And that was the most powerful thing of all.